Another massacre in the U.S., 21 killed, including 19 children. This is the 8th mass shooting in the U.S. this year so far, and it's only the month of May. Why do mass shootings in the U.S. take place in the first place, more so than any other country in the world? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will take a look at why there's not a strong enough appetite or will from U.S. lawmakers, perhaps, either whether it's Republicans or Democrats, to put an end to this wave of violence unless what's inscribed in the Second Amendment or the powerful NRA gun lobby are the main obstacles in reaching that. First, let me introduce our guests for this edition of the Spotlight. Gerald Horne, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston, joins us from Houston, Texas. Also joining us is David Swanson, who's the director of World Beyond War, who joins us from Charlottesville. Okay, welcome to you both. So obviously, I'm going to start with a question from you, Gerald Horne, and ask you for a reaction to what has happened, because it's obviously very depressing and very shocking that this has happened yet again in the U.S.
It's horrible, it's terrible, but it's also predictable. It's predictable because, number one, the United States operates under an archaic and antiquated constitution from the 18th century, during the era of the acceleration of the invasion of European settlers who thought that they needed weapons in order to massacre Native Americans, to take their land, and to import more enslaved Africans, and needing weapons to keep them in line. And as you suggested, there's a Second Amendment that tends to validate that. But since then, you have this point that the right-wing movement in this country has latched onto that, because the right-wing movement in this country says that there should be no change in the antiquated interpretation of the Second Amendment, because it might be necessary at some point in the 21st century, for example, for their movement to overthrow a government that they don't approve of. And then this industry, the arms industry, is a very profitable industry. It has been described as perpetrating an iron river of weapons into Mexico, which has really been very helpful to certain kinds of drug cartels, for example. They're meeting in Houston, Texas, as I speak, and there are about 55,000 members of the National Rifle Association, which is one of the most powerful grassroots organizations in this country. And then I think that we should not distinguish the point that this movement is based upon white supremacy, based upon this idea that those defined as white have a virtual and veritable divine right to rule over everyone else in this country. And I would also say that when you have a foreign policy of the United States which privileges war, which routinely is involved in massacres of people in Afghanistan over the past 2 or 3 decades, or in Iraq in recent years, and other sites too numerous to mention, that it leads to the cheapening of life. And that cheapening of life has now returned with a vengeance back to the United States of America.
So what do you think, David Swanson? You have different dynamics involved here, of which, due to lack of time, I'd like to see how you can put this into perspective for us. On the one hand, you have the lawmakers, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. It seems like Democrats are more pro control of the situation in terms of gun control, for example, rather than Republicans. At the same time, you have what's been called the NRA, which, you know, like Gerald Horne said there, they're a powerful lobby group. What does that exactly mean? Can you put these things that are pulling against what should be the prevention of the loss of life?
Well, I agree with every word that Professor Horne said there. There are structural problems and there are cultural problems. There are nations on this planet with similar cultures that have fixed the problem to an extraordinary extent structurally by banning guns. And the reason that this doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. is principally that they have legalized bribery and turned it into campaign contributions and made it perfectly acceptable so that politicians are openly bought and paid for. They also have this system of 2 parties in which, as on many issues, on this issue, one party, the Republicans, are openly and strongly against preventing gun proliferation, and the other party claims to be for doing something, but always manages to have a handful of its members against its supposed mission, even though it has the majority, and prioritizes keeping in place archaic rules like the filibuster that require it to have a supermajority that it doesn't have. And so it will use these tragedies as campaign material. Elect even more of us and we'll do even more than the nothing that we've done so far, rather than taking action to do something about it. And you do have a culture that's been saturated with acceptance of violence. You have the U.S. government through, in this case, the U.S. Navy, funding programs in schools like the one attended by the latest shooter to entice those who can't afford college, because college has outpriced many people in this country, to enter a program called ROTC, where they're trained to shoot guns. Very often, these shooters in high schools have been through these programs, have been trained by the U.S. government. In fact, the famous one in Florida was wearing the T-shirt from the junior ROTC when he shot up his classmates. And very disproportionately, mass shooters across the United States are veterans of the U.S. military, of U.S. wars. And so there is a culture of violence at home and abroad that creates these vicious cycles. And it's a society saturated in both violence and guns. And unfortunately, we don't have a political system that seems capable of dealing with it unless we see a mass uprising of nonviolent action. And of course, the people of the United States are the least likely people in the world to do such a thing.
Gerald Horne, when looking through and sifting through some of the points that could have been addressed in this program, one of the things that stood out is a tweet by this one particular person, which was pretty striking when I read it, and it said, in retrospect, Sandy Hook marked the end of the U.S. gun control debate. Once America decided killing children was bearable, it was over. Now that itself is deep in the way that it impacted at least a point of view of such for me. But then when you take a look at what could be even more impactful would be when you have the use of guns and how it has killed politicians. Martin Luther King, for example, Kennedy, for example, and yet we're still looking at this being an issue in the U.S. So obviously there doesn't seem to be enough of an appetite, willpower, or initiative, or whatever you'd like to call it, for this to end. How can this be channeled in order to reach a solution?
Well, that is the question, is it not? But one has to say that when you have these formidable, profound issues in the United States of America, what has helped to change the calculus has been international pressure. That's the reason why slavery ended. That's the reason why U.S. apartheid, or Jim Crow as it has been called, began to retreat. That is why the United States was ultimately driven out of Vietnam in the 1970s, for example. And I dare say that because of the formidable nature of this so-called white American population, which unites across class lines, whether people want to acknowledge it or not, and is determined to hold on to power by any means necessary. Recall that it was only a few days ago that you had this racist massacre in Buffalo, New York, where 10 black people were killed at a store. The massacre perpetrator was motivated by this idea that the demographics of the United States are changing, that people not defined as white are becoming the majority, and he was determined to overturn that by his own crude action. And so we need more international pressure against the United States, not least because even those who consider themselves to be well-intentioned in the so-called white majority oftentimes have an inadequate analysis, which leads to inadequate prescriptions, which then leads us on this vicious cycle back to killing 10-year-old children in a classroom.
NRA is going to be coming to Texas in a matter of days, from what we understand, David Swanson. You're going to have a number of politicians speaking there. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, we understand, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump. One thing he did when he was in office was, based on some of the things I'm reading here, reversing an Obama-era policy that had to that was dealing with restricting gun purchases by people, and deemed by the Social Security Administration to be mentally unable to manage their affairs. He reversed that. So that's just a reflection of how even former U.S. President looked at the matter. Why is there such a divide when it comes to U.S. politicians or lawmakers, I should say?
You know, when you started to mention a tweet, I thought you might be going toward a recent tweet prior to this latest massacre by the governor of Texas, pushing people in Texas to buy more guns because they were shamefully in second place behind California. There's a culture of love for guns. It's not a necessary evil. They're celebrated. The more guns, the better. And it's a cultural identity, a partisan political identity. You just in the hour before we were speaking, saw that same Texas governor have a press conference interrupted by the Democrat who had run for governor against him, demanding that something be done about guns. This, a complete, almost worthless, sellout corporate moderate Democrat candidate, but even he willing to say something about guns, at least until he can get himself into office. You have a congressional race, a Democratic primary happening right now, the votes being counted in Texas, between a Democrat who's, you know, worthless on most issues but willing to take a stand on guns, and the incumbent Democrat who's absolutely against doing anything about guns. And you have the Democratic leadership in Washington, D.C. doing everything they can to keep that incumbent in office, even while claiming that they are the ones against guns. And so you have this endless hypocritical compromising from the Democrats, and this cultural celebration of guns as a wonderful, heroic things. If you don't have weapons of war in your house, the government is going to come get you. You know, this government that can't tie its own shoes. And so there is a cultural divide, and there is you know, a political logjam.
Yeah, and some of the stats that I'm looking at, David Swanson, which points to the question that I want to ask you, I'm sorry, Gerald Horne, is the fact that, so you have these massacres, 8 of them so far, by the way, and it's only May, as I mentioned in the intro. People are dying from gun violence on a daily basis in the U.S., daily basis. Now, this particular source talks about 45,000, somewhat, maybe 45,800 injuries that include deaths. It doesn't get into the complete number. It says 2020 is the furthest of this database that they have. But anyways, if it is such an issue, which it is, this gun culture and how guns lead to deaths and people are using it to kill each other, why isn't it highlighted more throughout the media in the U.S. on a weekly basis, I don't know, on news channels, or more education perhaps on it in schools, etc.? Is that happening and still not working?
It is happening to a degree. It needs to happen more, but I have to repeat what I said a moment or two ago. The ultimate problem is the fact that this gun culture comes from the bloody history of the United States of America, the history of a European invasion where the people who were not only rich, but the people who were poor and were settlers and defined as white were armed so that they could kill Native Americans. I'm sitting here in Texas. 200 years ago, this land was teeming with indigenous populations, particularly the Comanches. They've all been liquidated, exterminated. And so that helped to create this culture. And then, as I said before, you have to keep the black population in line, which is still happening to this very day. Many of our liberal friends buy into the mythology about the Constitution and the so-called sacred founding of the United States in 1776, which prevents them from dealing and grappling honestly with this bloody history. Instead, they blame political parties, which of course are ultimately dependent upon this same majority white electorate, which I've just excoriated. And so until we are able to deal honestly with this history, we will be continually
let's go with that line.
Yeah,
let's go with that line that you're talking about. Dave Swanson, last question. God forbid that any type of social crisis which the U.S. is teetering on breaks out in terms of a civil unrest of a massive scale, large in numbers in the U.S., where you have guns almost outnumbering the people. Isn't the U.S. government worried about something like that happening? 30 seconds.
I don't think there's a grave danger of that happening. I do think there's a grave danger of these shootings continuing and multiplying, and of the continuation of nothing being done in Washington, D.C. But in terms of a violent uprising in the United States, I don't think it's much more likely than a nonviolent one, which is what we actually need, but is extremely unlikely due to the disempowerment in people's own minds.
Thank you, David Swanson, Director of the World Beyond War at Charlottesville. Gerald Horne, thank you, Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, from Houston, Texas. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kawatawe and the team. It's goodbye.